A millionaire humiliates his wife by throwing wine at her after she refuses to pay the bill. He didn't expect her response. The waiter placed the bill on the table, and James pushed it directly towards Sarah. "You pay," he ordered, not even looking at her. Sarah crossed her arms. "No." A heavy silence fell between them. James slowly raised his eyes as if he hadn't understood. "What?" "You heard me," Sarah replied firmly. "If you want to impress others, pay for it." The tension was palpable. Emily Anderson smiled to herself, swirling her glass of wine as if she were enjoying the spectacle. "Sarah, darling, let's not dramatize," she said sweetly, with false charm. But James no longer heard anything. His face turned red with anger. Without warning, he grabbed his glass and poured the wine straight into Sarah's face. The impact of the cold, thick liquid took her breath away for a moment. Shocked murmurs echoed around the restaurant. Sarah blinked, feeling the wine run down her skin, staining her light dress. But instead of shrinking away, she grabbed her phone and started recording. "What do you think you're doing?" James lunged forward to snatch the phone from her hands. She stepped back. "Showing everyone who you really are." The restaurant patrons watched in shock. Some whispered, others pulled out their own phones. James realized he had lost control. The manager approached, serious. "Mr. Anderson, we need you and your mother to leave immediately." Emily stood up, adjusting her necklace with feigned poise. "This is absurd. Do you know who you're speaking to? And do you know where you are?" The manager retorted. "Ms. Sarah can stay. You two, not so much." James huffed, throwing his napkin onto the table. "You'll regret this," he threatened, pointing at Sarah before storming out with his mother. She took a napkin and wiped her face. When the waiter asked if she wanted another bill, Sarah smiled. "No, I'm not paying for this dinner." And before she left, she glanced at James, now swearing into his phone outside. She leaned slightly and whispered, "Oh, and your money? It's already out of your reach." James's expression went blank. Sarah smiled and moved on. Sarah crossed through the glass doors of the police station with firm steps, but the invisible weight of what she was about to do made her breathing shallow. Her dress still carried the stains of wine spilled by James hours earlier, but at that moment, it hardly mattered. For the first time in 15 years, she was about to tell everything. The police station's lobby was quiet at that time of night. A few plastic chairs were occupied by people waiting for assistance, the distant sound of computer keys clicking, a phone ringing in the background. None of it was louder than the whirlwind of thoughts in her head. "Can I help you?" A firm voice brought her back to reality. Officer Jessica Brown stood before her, dark-haired, with her hair tied in a tight bun, a serious look and a professional posture. There was something in her expression that conveyed confidence, as though nothing could surprise her. "I want to file a report," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. Jessica merely nodded and gestured for her to follow. The walk to the office was short. Sarah sat down across from the officer at the metal desk, while Jessica grabbed a notebook. "Full name of the accused?" "James Anderson." Jessica raised her eyes, the name clearly familiar to her. "Your husband?" "My ex-husband," Sarah corrected. The officer leaned back in her chair, assessing her. "And what's the accusation?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I'll need time. This didn't start today." And so she began to speak. In the first few minutes, her voice wavered, as if the words were still fighting against years of forced silence. But as the details flowed, the hesitation gave way to certainty. She spoke about the years of isolation, how James controlled her finances, her steps, even her identity. She explained how, little by little, she realized her life was a gilded prison and that he would never let her leave without paying a high price. Jessica wrote down every detail without interrupting, occasionally asking Sarah to clarify certain points. When she finished recounting the most recent events, the attempted humiliation at the restaurant, the wine attack, and James trying to take her phone, Sarah felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The silence in the room was broken by the persistent buzz of her phone. Sarah looked at the device on the desk. The screen lit up with the name she knew all too well. James. Jessica noticed and leaned slightly forward. He's calling? Sarah shook her head and swiped across the screen, opening the messages. What she saw made her stomach turn. You're making a mistake. You want to destroy our family. Come home now and we can talk. If you don't answer, you'll regret it. Then the tone of the messages changed. Sarah, please, I love you. Let's work this out together. I was just upset. You know I would never really hurt you. I need you. You mean everything to me. She didn't need to read anymore. She knew this manipulative dance well. First came the anger, then the threats, and finally the desperation. He wasn't sorry for anything. He just felt he was losing control. Do you want to include these messages in your report? Jessica asked. Sarah nodded and slid her phone toward the officer. There's more. Jessica raised an eyebrow. More? Evidence. For years, I've collected documents on the financial dealings of the Anderson family. I've recorded everything. James and his mother didn't just use my money to maintain their lifestyle. They also laundered money through companies that were intentionally bankrupted. Jessica was silent for a moment, processing the weight of the revelation. Do you have access to these documents? I have digital copies stored and a physical folder kept in a safe place. Before the officer could respond, the door to the room opened. Sarah. The voice came like a whisper from the past. Sarah turned and froze upon seeing Olivia Anderson standing in the doorway. James's sister looked strikingly different from the last time they had met, years ago. She was wearing jeans and a leather jacket, her brown hair now cut short, lacking the shine from when she was still part of the Anderson dynasty. What are you doing here? Sarah asked, still processing the sudden appearance. Olivia closed the door behind her. I heard about what happened. I need to show you something. She placed a battered folder on the table. Sarah exchanged a glance with Jessica before opening the document. Her heart raced as she flipped through the yellowed pages filled with notes, old bank statements, and redacted contracts. What is this? Olivia exhaled deeply, as if gathering the courage to speak was a physical effort. The truth about our family. Jessica leaned forward to examine the documents. This looks big. It is, Olivia confirmed. The Anderson empire wasn't built on legitimate businesses. They always had one pattern: marry successful women, destroy their businesses, and use bankruptcy to launder money. Sarah, you weren't the first. The air seemed to leave her lungs. What do you mean? Olivia pointed to a name on one of the pages. Emma Harris. Sarah frowned. Who's that? The first wife of our Uncle Robert. Olivia swallowed hard. She died shortly after losing everything. The silence in the room was deafening. My God, Sarah whispered. Jessica picked up the notebook again. We need to file this immediately. Olivia shook her head. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah looked at the folder, then at Jessica, and finally at Olivia. For the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Sarah's phone buzzed on the table in the police station, interrupting the discussion about the documents Olivia had revealed. Still reeling from the discoveries, she grabbed the device, unaware that the next call would send her racing against time. Mrs. Sarah? This is Dr. Salazar from San Ramon Hospital. Someone tried to break into your sister's room. Her blood ran cold. What do you mean? Is she okay? The security team arrived just in time, but the intruder fled before they could identify him. Emma is shaken up and asked to speak with you immediately." Sarah stood up abruptly, already heading for the door. Olivia and Jessica exchanged glances and followed without hesitation. "We're coming with you," Jessica asserted, already grabbing the car keys. On the way, the silence in the car was thick. Sarah felt an increasing sense of dread in her chest. Since Emma's cancer diagnosis, she had always sensed that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. Now, after everything she had uncovered about the Andersons, the missing piece seemed about to fall into place. "This wasn't a coincidence," Olivia murmured from the passenger seat. "They know we're getting close." "Who else knew where Emma was hospitalized?" Jessica asked, focused on the road. Sarah clenched her fists. "Besides me, James, and Emily." Jessica didn't say anything, but her expression hardened. When they arrived at the hospital, Sarah jumped out of the car before it had even fully stopped. She ran up the stairs as if every second was a wasted chance. As she turned the corner to the inpatient ward, she stopped suddenly. At the door to Emma's room were Emily and Brian Harris. Emily Anderson, with her eternal air of superiority, appeared to be in full control of the situation. Brian, the accountant whom Sarah once thought of as an ally, stood beside her, his face tense, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Sarah demanded, her anger bubbling to the surface. Emily flashed a cold smile. "Darling, we came to visit Emma. After all, we're family." Sarah looked at Jessica, who was already placing a hand on her gun holster. "Is everything all right here?" the officer asked, assessing the situation. Emily maintained her composure. "Just a courtesy visit." "We can't help it if your sister had a scare." "A scare?" Sarah scoffed without humor. "She was almost attacked and you conveniently show up minutes later." "Sarah, don't be paranoid." Brian finally spoke, his voice soft but carrying an undertone that sent a chill through her. Without patience for their games, Sarah ignored both of them and entered the room. Emma was sitting up in bed, pale and visibly shaken. Her eyes widened when she saw Sarah. "They were here before," she whispered, gripping her sister's hand tightly. "What happened?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her. Emma took a deep breath before speaking. "I know why they want to silence me." "What did you find out?" She hesitated for a moment, as if the words were too heavy to say. "I know who killed Robert Anderson." The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "What?" "It was Emily." The statement hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Sarah looked at Jessica, who immediately pulled out her notebook. "Are you sure about this?" Emma nodded. "For years, I knew that Robert Anderson wanted out of the family business. He wanted to clear the Anderson name, cut all the frauds. But Emily couldn't allow that, so she killed him." "How do you know this?" Olivia asked, still processing the information. Emma swallowed hard. "Because she started poisoning me after I found out." Sarah's heart stopped for a second. "What?" "When I got sick, I thought it was just bad luck. But then I realized everything started after I began investigating old documents. My tests always showed something strange in my blood." Sarah put her hand over her mouth. "Do you have proof?" With trembling hands, Emma pulled out a notebook hidden beneath her pillow and handed it to Sarah. "It's all here, and there's more." Sarah flipped through the pages, seeing notes, dates, names. Then Emma pointed to an underlined paragraph. "The last secret of them is in that painting." "What painting?" Emma looked her in the eyes. "The one I gave you as a wedding gift." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The lighthouse painting, the one that had hung in her and James's house for years. "What's in that painting?" "A code, the location of the secret account where Emily hid all the family money. If we get it, we can take them down once and for all." Sarah's phone buzzed on the hospital table. Her heart was already heavy with everything she had discovered that night, but when she saw James's name on the screen, a shiver ran down her spine. Hesitantly, she opened the message. It was a photo. James's office, exactly as she remembered it, but with one difference. The wall where the lighthouse painting had once been was now bare. The frame had left a distinct mark on the dark wallpaper, like a shadow of what had once been there. The next message came just seconds after. "You know what this means. See you at the Anderson Lake." Sarah felt a knot form in her throat. The painting was gone, and James knew she understood its importance. "What happened?" Olivia asked, noticing the change in her face. Sarah turned the phone toward her and Jessica so they could see the message. "He wants me to meet him at the Anderson Lake." Jessica narrowed her eyes. "It's a trap." "Of course it is," Sarah whispered. She glanced at Emma, who was weak but attentive. Her sister gripped her hand tightly, her fingers trembling. "You have to go," Emma said, her voice weaker than she would have liked. "I can't leave you here," Sarah retorted. Emma took a deep breath, gathering the last of her strength. "If this painting really holds a secret that can take them down, then you need to get it. This is the end, Sarah." "But what if it's a trick? And what if it isn't?" Emma stared at her sister. "You've spent your whole life trapped by them. This is your chance to end it all." Sarah felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. Staying meant ensuring Emma's safety, but going was the only way to make sure the Andersons would never threaten them again. Jessica saw the dilemma and intervened. "I'll stay here with Emma. If James wants to meet you at the lake, then he isn't focused on her right now, but I won't let anything happen to your sister." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment before nodding. Before she left, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. Samantha answered on the second ring. "If you're calling me, then something very serious has happened." Her ex-best friend's voice came, heavy with surprise and caution. "I need your help." Sarah was direct. A brief silence followed. "You said you'd never speak to me again." "I know, and I was wrong." Samantha sighed. "What do you need?" "James has the painting. He called me to meet him at Anderson Lake. Emily and Brian will probably be there. And you're going. I have no choice." This time, the silence was longer. Sarah could feel Samantha weighing the risks the way she always did. "I'm on my way," Samantha finally responded, "but don't go there alone." The call ended. Sarah sighed and, without saying anything further, headed toward the car. The road to Anderson Lake was long and winding. The tall trees on both sides seemed to form a dark tunnel, and the car's headlights were the only source of light in the emptiness. The sky was heavy with clouds, threatening rain, making the journey even more oppressive. As she drove, Sarah realized something that made her shudder. James had always known this could happen. For years, he had molded her into a submissive wife, someone who would never challenge him. But somewhere, in his sick and calculating mind, he had known there was a chance that Sarah would rebel. He must have had a plan for it. The question was she ready to face him? The car skidded slightly as it left the asphalt and entered the dirt road leading to Anderson Lake. The surrounding landscape grew even darker as she neared the destination. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She parked a few meters from the old family cabin. Turning off the engine, she stayed seated for a moment, trying to calm her breathing. But her instincts screamed that something was very wrong. And then she saw it. James was standing on the cabin's porch, waiting. Behind him, in the flickering light of the house, stood Emily and Brian. They were ready to welcome her. The night was dense and silent when Sarah parked the car in front of the lake house. The cold wind carried the smell of stagnant water and wet grass, and the darkness around her seemed to swallow everything. She stepped out of the vehicle slowly, feeling the tension build in every muscle. The sound of dry leaves cracking beneath her feet seemed too loud, as if the very environment was warning her not to go further. But she had no choice. James was waiting for her on the threshold. Unlike every other time she had faced him, he didn't have his usual arrogant smile or superior gaze. There was something different about him. His shoulders were slouched, his posture less imposing. He seemed tired, or perhaps defeated. "You took your time," he said, his voice softer than usual. Sarah stopped a few steps from him, holding her ground. "Where is the painting?" James let out a short laugh, but it lacked humor. Always so predictable. "Come in." He opened the door and stepped inside. Sarah hesitated for a moment before following him. The lake house hadn't changed. The same rustic furniture, the same heavy curtains, the same woody smell. But there was something in the air that made everything feel different. A charged atmosphere, as if the space had absorbed all the dirty secrets of the Anderson family and was about to release them. James walked over to the fireplace and pointed. There it was, the lighthouse painting, leaning against the cold stone, as if it were just any other object. Sarah's heart raced. That canvas contained the clue that could destroy the Andersons, but she knew James thought it was all she had against him. "Is this what you want?" he asked, crossing his arms. Sarah lifted her chin. "You know it is." James narrowed his eyes, studying her for a moment. "Then trade with me. The painting for your sister." Before Sarah could react, a new voice echoed through the room. "Oh, James, don't be so direct. Let's have a little more fun." Emily Anderson appeared at the top of the stairs, descending with practiced calm. Her eyes shone with the same coldness as always, but her smile was even crueler than Sarah remembered. "Mom, this isn't necessary," James began, but Emily raised her hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Be quiet, James. You've ruined everything up to this point." James clenched his fists but said nothing. For the first time, Sarah realized something she hadn't before. He wasn't just a cruel and controlling man. He was a prisoner. Emily turned her attention to Sarah. "You have two choices, my dear. You can hand over all the evidence you have against our family and leave here with your life, or—" She paused, letting the poisoned words slide slowly from her lips. "We can make sure your sister never leaves that hospital." The air seemed to vanish from the room. Sarah felt fear creep up her spine, but she kept her expression unchanged. She wouldn't show them fear. "You've already lost. It doesn't matter what you do now," Emily laughed. "Oh dear. We only lose when we say we've lost." Sarah quickly glanced at James, who wore a tense expression. He knew that this was a losing game. But Emily, with her obsession for control, still believed she could turn the tables. That's when the sound of sirens cut through the night. James's eyes widened. He turned to his mother, stunned. "What have you done?" Emily froze for a second before casting a furious look at Sarah. "You called the police." Sarah gave a small smile. "FBI, actually." The doors to the house burst open with a bang, and federal agents flooded the room, guns raised, firm commands filling the space. James stepped back, looking as though he couldn't process what was happening. Emily, however, remained still, her eyes glazed over. "Hands up!" one of the agents ordered. Brian, who had been silent the entire time, tried to run to the back door, but was taken down before he could take 3 steps. James, still in shock, slowly raised his hands. It was in that moment that everything collapsed for him. "This is your fault!" James exploded, turning on Emily. She blinked, surprised. "What? You always told me I should trust you. You always said I'd never lose. And now we're here." His voice came out desperate, trembling. For the first time, Sarah saw James without the mask. He was no longer the confident man trying to manipulate her. He wasn't the husband who controlled everything. He was just a terrified son, raised to blindly follow his mother's orders. Emily pressed her lips together, controlling her anger. "You're weak, James. You've been weak your entire life, and that's why you're on your knees now." James stared at his mother for a few seconds, then lowered his head. When the agents handcuffed him, he didn't resist. He simply accepted his fate. Emily, on the other hand, remained upright, unmoving, her eyes fixed on Sarah. "You think you've won?" Her voice came low, almost a whisper. Sarah only watched her as the agents pulled her arms behind her. "You have no idea what's still to come." And then she was taken away. Sarah let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of the tension finally begin to leave her body. The nightmare was coming to an end, but deep down, she knew this story was far from over. The sirens were still echoing across Anderson Lake as FBI agents spread out across the property. The cold night air carried a suffocating tension, while the red and blue lights reflected off the dark water. Sarah stood from a distance, her arms crossed over her chest, her heart pounding. The Anderson downfall was happening right before her eyes. Emily was the first to be handcuffed. Even subdued, she kept her high and mighty gaze, as though she still believed she was in control. Her eyes passed over Sarah, analyzing her like a hunter eyeing its prey. When one of the agents pushed her gently to make her walk, she showed no resistance. She moved with calculated dignity, as if she had prepared for this moment her whole life. James, on the other hand, was the opposite. The man who had once prided himself on his imposing presence was now hunched over, his shoulders slumped, his gaze lost. When the agents took him into custody, he didn't even try to fight back. There was nothing more to do. "You ruined everything," he muttered, looking at his mother. Emily merely observed him, her lips pursed. "You destroyed yourself," she replied coldly. The sound of the handcuffs clicking echoed loudly, sealing James Anderson's fate. Outside, Brian Harris tried to flee into the woods, but he didn't get far. 2 agents tackled him to the ground before he could disappear into the trees. He shouted, struggled, tried to argue, but no one was listening. His fate was sealed along with the rest of the Andersons. It was then that Sarah saw Samantha. Her ex-best friend, now at the forefront of the operation, walked out of the house with an impassive expression. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the past between them seemed to resurface. The broken friendship, the years of silence, the mutual disappointment. But now, here, amidst arrests and revelations, there was something different in Samantha's gaze. "You're safe now," she said, approaching. Sarah nodded. There was no longer room for pride or resentment. Samantha had been there when she needed her most. "We found something inside the house," Samantha continued, casting a meaningful glance. Sarah and Olivia exchanged looks. Something was still hidden. Following Samantha into the house, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The place seemed darker than before, as though it had lost any trace of life. In the library, one of the agents pointed to the leather chair where Emily used to sit like a queen on her personal throne. Behind it, a section of the wall was slightly displaced. "It was hard to notice," the agent explained. "But when we moved the chair, we found a secret panel. With a simple push, the panel slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, there were old folders, boxes of documents, and a small safe, locked with a digital code. Robert Anderson kept everything," Olivia murmured, staring at the papers. Samantha grabbed one of the folders and opened it, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. "These are the original records of the family's transactions. Here are the money laundering schemes, the forged contracts, the purchases of bankrupt companies. This is more than enough to destroy anyone involved." Sarah picked up one of the papers and read the names written on it. Businessmen, politicians, bankers. The Andersons weren't just a corrupt family. They were part of something much bigger. That's when a soft laugh echoed through the room. Emily Anderson, even handcuffed, watched the scene with amusement. "Oh, you think this is all?" she said, her voice laced with irony. Samantha turned toward her, eyes narrowed. "Want to tell us something, Emily?" Emily tilted her head slightly, her cruel smile still on her lips. "You've only found the surface." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, feeling her frustration grow. Emily sighed as though tired of the ignorance around her. "My father-in-law, Charles Anderson, started this empire decades ago. Robert tried to change things, but it was too late. I got into this as a victim, but if there's one thing I learned, it's that you only survive in this game if you're smarter than your enemies." Sarah felt the impact of the name. Charles Anderson. "You always said Robert was in charge." Emily laughed again. "Robert was just a naive idealist. Charles built everything. When he died, I had to take control. And now, you think a few folders and documents are enough to destroy all of this?" Samantha crossed her arms. "If it's not enough, then what's missing?" Emily looked at Sarah directly. "You know where the real key is. It's right beneath our feet." The silence in the room became unbearable. Sarah processed the words slowly, trying to understand what it meant. It was Olivia who realized it first. "The foundations," Emily smiled. "Charles was a meticulous man. He hid his biggest secrets where no one would ever think to look, in the foundations of the Anderson family houses." Sarah felt a chill run up her spine. "Then we're not done yet." Samantha took a deep breath, closing the folder in her hands. "No, this has only just begun." Sarah looked at Olivia, and in that instant they both understood that the fight was far from over. The Andersons might be falling, but the true heart of the empire was still buried. The FBI didn't waste any time. As soon as Emily revealed that the deepest secrets of the Andersons were hidden in the foundations of their homes, agents began searching every property linked to the family. Sarah followed everything from a distance, watching as the homes that once symbolized power and impunity were turned into scenes of criminal investigation. The main Anderson mansion was the first to be searched. The agents used thermal scanners, trackers, and even sniffer dogs. In a hidden basement, they found old files containing records of illegal transactions, boxes of undeclared cash, and jewelry that had likely been acquired with misappropriated funds. The house, once exuding luxury and ostentation, now seemed like a mausoleum of secrets. In James's apartment in downtown Mexico City, a team found a safe hidden behind a false wall. Inside, there were fraudulent contracts, manipulated tax documents, and evidence of bribery involving public officials. Sarah watched the scene through her phone screen as one of the agents sent her photos of the material. She recognized those papers. They were the same contracts James had claimed didn't exist when she was still his wife, but the biggest discovery happened at one of the family's country houses on the outskirts of Monterey. During the search, investigators identified a trapdoor hidden beneath the floor in the dining room. When they opened it, they revealed an underground tunnel leading to a room full of shelves containing files, hard drives, and old cassette tapes. "This is a gold mine," one of the agents commented, examining the documents. The evidence found not only confirmed the Andersons' financial schemes, but also linked the family to organized crime in other countries. Sarah shuddered as she read some of the names on the files. Businessmen, politicians, judges, the web of corruption was much larger than they had imagined. While the Anderson empire was collapsing, Emma fought to recover. At the hospital, doctors finally managed to stabilize her health. Without the poison that had slowly been consuming her, her body began to respond positively to the treatment. Sarah visited her every day, watching her sister regain some of the strength she once had. "You look stronger today," Sarah said, holding her hand. Emma smiled, still weak, but determined. "It's because, for the first time in years, I'm not dying a little every day." Sarah bit her lip. She knew Emma still had something to tell her. "What is it?" Emma sighed, staring at the ceiling for a moment before meeting her gaze. "Robert Anderson wasn't the true leader of this empire, not even Emily. They were just pawns. Sarah frowned. Who was behind it? Emma hesitated for a moment, as if the name was hard to say. Charles Anderson. The confirmation hit like a stone. Charles, the patriarch, who had been treated as a respected businessman, had always been at the heart of it all. But now, it seemed that everything came back to him. As Sarah tried to process this revelation, she received another unexpected piece of news. Emily had left a will. At first, it seemed like just a formal document. But when Sarah read it, she realized that her former mother-in-law, even imprisoned, was still making unexpected moves. The will didn't just confirm all the family's crimes, but also stated that the remaining assets of the Andersons would be allocated to a fund to support victims of financial abuse. Sarah felt a mix of surprise and suspicion. Emily never did anything without a hidden reason. "Do you believe she did this out of regret?" Olivia asked after reading the document. "No," Sarah answered without hesitation. Emily never regretted anything. But before she could think more about it, another piece of news arrived. James Anderson was trying to negotiate a deal. Without money, without allies, and without his mother's protection, James had become a broken man. He was attempting to bargain for his freedom, offering information in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Sarah was allowed to see him one last time before the trial. When she entered the visitation room of the prison, she found a man she hardly recognized. The James she once knew, arrogant, confident, manipulative, was gone. What remained was a pale man with deep, dark circles under his eyes and a lost expression. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah crossed her arms. "What do you want, James?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak was a huge effort. "I can give you something in exchange for a chance." She let out a short laugh. "You think you have something to offer me?" He lifted his eyes, trying to find some weakness in her, but there was nothing left for him to manipulate. "The will of my mother," he began. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "What's in it?" James hesitated, then forced a weak smile. "If I tell you, will you help me?" She leaned slightly forward. "No." His expression hardened. For the first time, Sarah saw real fear in James's eyes. He knew there was no way out. Without saying another word, she stood up and left the room. But something still bothered Sarah, the way James mentioned the will, as if there was something more hidden within it. She decided to review the documents again, and then she realized it. In the middle of the pages, there was a reference to the Anderson family's main office. "There's something there." Without wasting time, she called Olivia. "We need to go to the office, now." Olivia didn't question it. She just grabbed the keys. When they arrived at the place, they found the property empty. The FBI agents had already removed most of the evidence, but something was still hidden. In Emily's office, Sarah noticed a strange detail on the floor. A mark, as if a piece of furniture had been recently moved. The mark on the floor in Emily's office was subtle, but to Sarah, it screamed like a warning. Something had been moved recently. She and Olivia exchanged glances before they began to push the heavy wooden bookshelf, feeling the resistance of the furniture. When they finally managed to move it, a painting, which seemed perfectly positioned on the wall, was revealed. "A Monet," Olivia murmured, observing the signature in the corner of the canvas. "An original," Sarah confirmed, her heart racing. The piece was beautiful, with subtle brushstrokes forming a serene landscape. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what was behind it. Carefully, Sarah ran her fingers along the frame, searching for a hidden mechanism. And then she felt a small raised spot. She pressed it, and with a dry click, the painting moved a few inches forward, revealing a safe embedded in the wall. They exchanged another glance. "What was Emily's code?" Olivia asked. Sarah thought for a moment. Emily was meticulous, but also predictable in her ego. She tried James's birth date. Nothing. The anniversary of her wedding to Robert. Still nothing. Taking a deep breath, she typed in her own birth date. The safe opened. For a moment, Sarah hesitated before pulling out its contents. Inside, there was a single black envelope with refined handwriting in the center. For the one who finally defeats me. Sarah's stomach churned. She slid her finger beneath the envelope's flap and pulled out the neatly folded papers. Silence fell over the room as she read the first lines. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you've won. Congratulations. I never thought you would make it this far. Rage surged up her chest, but she kept reading. I know you've always seen me as the villain, and in a way, I was. But you never knew the whole story. You never knew what was necessary to keep this empire standing. Not for greed, not for the desire for power, but for survival. James was never strong enough to protect himself. He needed me, and I needed to keep this game going, to make sure he wouldn't be the next victim. I knew what happened to those who tried to leave. Robert learned that the hard way. I wouldn't make the same mistake. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Emily was indirectly admitting that the corrupt system Charles Anderson had built was never just about money. There was something deeper, a network of influence that eliminated anyone who tried to break it. She turned the page and kept reading. You wonder why I left this for you? Simple. Because in the end, you won. And ironically, because you remind me of myself when I was young. I was like you, Sarah. I believed I could change things, but I learned that the world is not kind to women who try to take control of their own lives. So consider this my final move. All the records the agents found are just fragments. I kept the real documents, the dirtiest transactions, and the names that really matter. And now everything is in your name. Sarah's heart stopped. What's wrong? Olivia asked, noticing her expression. Sarah pulled out the last sheet of paper from the envelope. It was a bank statement. At the top, a name she didn't recognize, but at the bottom, a detail that made her catch her breath, a balance of tens of millions of dollars. The stolen money, Sarah murmured. Emily hadn't just hidden the family fortune. She had transferred it to a series of secret accounts, and now they were all in Sarah's name. She transferred everything to you, Olivia asked, stunned. Sarah kept reading the letter. You can do whatever you want with this money. You can burn it, hide it, or use it for revenge, but I know what you will choose, because deep down, you've always been different from me. You don't want revenge. You want justice. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. Emily knew her too well. She turned to Olivia. We'll return it all. Olivia frowned. Are you sure? That money could guarantee your safety forever. Sarah took a deep breath. This was never about money. If I keep it, I'll be perpetuating everything the Andersons did. The decision was made. In the following days, Sarah worked alongside lawyers and the FBI to ensure that the funds would be directed towards something that truly made a difference. They created an organization dedicated to helping women who had been victims of financial and emotional abuse, offering legal support, psychological assistance, and opportunities to rebuild. The Anderson empire had been built on lies and destruction, but now, from the ashes, something new was being born. The name Anderson, once a symbol of corruption, would become a symbol of hope. Sarah knew that the past could never be erased, but at least she could ensure that the future would be different. And that would be her true victory. The weight of the Anderson family history was heavier than Sarah and Olivia had imagined. With the records found in hidden safes and the documents left by Emily, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The true mastermind behind all the family corruption wasn't Robert nor Emily. The name that appeared repeatedly in the files, always in the shadows of the big business deals, was Charles Anderson. He was never just a businessman, Sarah murmured, flipping through the pages of a dossier that dated back nearly 50 years. Olivia watched the handwritten notes, the irregular contracts, the letters sent to influential politicians. My grandfather was always treated as the family icon, the one who built our legacy. But this proves that he built a criminal network, not a legitimate business empire. Charles Anderson was a strategist. Since the 1970s, he had not only created companies, but had made sure they served as facades for illegal operations. Money laundering, bribery, funding political campaigns. He manipulated the system so that the Andersons became untouchable. The record showed he used arranged marriages to expand his reach, ensuring that the wives of the family became pawns in the financial game. Sarah finally understood that she wasn't the first nor the last woman to be sucked into this scheme. Then they received an unexpected call. Emily Anderson was willing to talk. In prison, she had remained silent, refusing to give any information. But now, with the inevitable destruction of the family closing in, she decided to confess. Sarah and Samantha found her sitting across from them in the interrogation room. The woman who had once been at the center of the Anderson empire looked smaller now, but her eyes still held the gleam of someone who had always believed she was one step ahead. "Charles always knew I would do whatever it took," Emily said, folding her hands on the cold table. "When we married, he wasn't looking for a wife. He wanted a successor." Sarah kept her gaze fixed on her. "You knew everything from the beginning." Emily smiled faintly. "Of course I knew, but it wasn't a choice. Do you think someone can just leave a system like this? Charles didn't trust anyone, not even his children. He trained me, molded me, prepared me to continue what he started." Her voice didn't carry regret, only a cold acknowledgement of the facts. "So why did you take control after Robert died?" Sarah pressed. Emily took a deep breath. "Because I knew James wouldn't survive in this world. He's always been weak. If it weren't for me, he would have been devoured." Sarah swallowed hard. Despite everything, Emily believed she had protected her son. "You say that as if it were an act of love," Sarah murmured. Emily merely smiled, but didn't answer. Samantha interrupted the silence. "With the records we have, we can dismantle everything. Do you have anything else to add?" Emily tilted her head slightly. "You think you're done? What Charles built wasn't just a family empire. It was a system, and systems survive the fall of a family." Her words hung in the air. Sarah felt a shiver run up her spine. Meanwhile, outside, the FBI was executing the largest operation ever carried out against the Anderson network of allies. Businessmen, politicians, lawyers, and judges who had protected the family for years began to fall. With each new arrest, the power structure Charles had built disintegrated. "They're not invincible," Samantha said to Sarah as they watched the news. "But how long until another group takes their place?" Sarah questioned. Samantha pressed her lips together. "That depends on us." While justice took its course, Emma was beginning her journey toward a new future. With the proper treatment, she was improving. She could walk on her own in the hospital now, and color was slowly returning to her face. "I owe my life to you," Emma said, holding Sarah's hand. "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied. "What matters is that you have a second chance." Emma nodded, determined, "And I know exactly what I'm going to do with it." She decided that once she was fully recovered, she would dedicate her life to helping women who had been through the same kind of financial and emotional abuse. She would create a project to offer support and guidance to those who, like her, had been victims of the system. The cycle of destruction the Andersons had created wouldn't end with the imprisonment of their leaders, but it could be fought with knowledge, strength, and support. Sarah, for her part, felt that for the first time, She had control over her own destiny. Revenge had already been served. James was finished, Emily destroyed, the Anderson empire reduced to ruins. But now Sarah realized there was something bigger than simply watching her tormentors fall. She could create something new. "What will you do now?" Olivia asked, observing her. Sarah smiled, feeling a relief she had never experienced before. Something they never imagined. "I'll make sure no one else goes through what I did." James Anderson still hadn't accepted defeat. Even in prison, stripped of power and influence, he still believed he could escape the fate that loomed over him. Sarah learned this when she received an unexpected call from Samantha. "He's managed to get a lawyer willing to negotiate a deal," the FBI agent said, her voice heavy with frustration. Sarah tightened her grip on the phone more than she meant to. How? With what money? He still has allies, people who don't want him to open his mouth about everything he knows. They're trying to reduce his sentence in exchange for information. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. James had always known how to play the game. From the beginning, he moved like a man who never considered the possibility of losing. Now, even behind bars, he was trying to manipulate the pieces of the board in his favor. But this time, it wouldn't work. Days later, Sarah found Olivia at the house that had once belonged to the family matriarch. The agents were still finishing their search of the last remaining documents when one of the boxes caught Sarah's attention. It was a dark wooden box, sealed, with an envelope resting on top of it. Her name was written on it. She opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out the yellowed pages. Emily Anderson's refined handwriting filled the page with carefully chosen words. "James, my son, if you are reading this, it means everything has fallen apart." Sarah's heart raced, but not everything is lost. The history of our family has always been written by those who knew how to wait. If you accept what needs to be done, there is still a future for you. Sarah turned the page, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. "If you take the blame for everything, I'll make sure part of our fortune remains safe. When you get out, you can start over. But for that, you need to be smart. You need to make everyone believe you were just a pawn in my game." Emily had planned one last blow. She knew that ruin was inevitable, so she made a pact with James. If he took responsibility for all the crimes, she would ensure that he had a future outside prison. But there was one problem. Emily thought she controlled everything, but she underestimated one thing, Sarah whispered, holding the letter tightly. "What?" Olivia asked. "That no one believes James anymore." The day of the trial arrived with a cloudy sky, heavy like the very fate awaiting James. Sarah entered the courtroom, feeling every eye on her but keeping her head high. James sat beside his lawyer, wearing a suit that no longer fit him as well. He was thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, but still trying to maintain a posture of confidence. The judge asked him to stand. "Do you have anything to say before the sentence is announced?" James cleared his throat, and his lawyer gave him a brief look before he started. "I was manipulated by my mother since I was born." His voice sounded carefully calculated. "I never had a choice. I grew up believing what we did was normal. When I realized the truth, I was already too trapped in this system to leave." Sarah almost laughed. It was a spectacle. James was trying to paint himself as a son, controlled by a powerful woman, a man who had no full understanding of what he was doing. But then it was her turn to speak. She stood up and walked toward the witness stand. "James Anderson is not a victim. He manipulated, lied, and destroyed lives because he liked the power it gave him. If anyone never tried to escape this system, it was him." Olivia and Emma also testified, detailing the frauds, the financial crimes, and the abuses James had carried out without hesitation. The bank records, the forged contracts, and the testimonies from victims formed a wall against any attempt at negotiation. The pact James and Emily had made died right there, in front of everyone. The judge took the documents and took a deep breath before speaking. James Anderson, this court finds you guilty of all the crimes listed. Your sentence is 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The silence in the room was overwhelming. James didn't immediately react. He seemed unable to process what had just happened. Then his eyes met Sarah's. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand. He had lost. The agents moved toward him and placed the handcuffs on his wrists. His body didn't resist, but his eyes said it all. Fear, anger, and the pain of realizing that he was no longer untouchable. As James was taken away, Sarah felt a wave of relief that she hadn't known in years. But there was still one final piece to the puzzle. Emily Anderson was called to court to hear her sentence. Unlike her son, she didn't try to justify herself. Sitting there in a beige prison uniform, she listened calmly as the judge declared her punishment. When the guards approached to take her, Sarah stood up. For the first time, Emily looked at her directly, without the barrier of superiority. Then, in a whisper that was almost imperceptible, she said, "In the end, we're all prisoners of something." Sarah felt a chill run up her spine. Emily smiled faintly, as if she still knew something no one else did. Then, without looking back, she walked out of the courtroom, accepting her defeat with the same calculated elegance she always had. The Anderson empire had been destroyed. James and Emily's trial marked the end of an era of corruption, manipulation, and abuse. But for Sarah, the true victory wasn't in the convictions or the money recovered. It was in what could be done from that point forward. Sitting in the office that was now hers, Sarah stared at the papers scattered across the table. Legal documents, bank records, and drafts of a project that, just a few months ago, had seemed impossible. Beside her, Olivia was reviewing the final details of the paperwork. "So it's official?" Olivia asked, looking up. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. "Yes, the Open Eyes Foundation is real." The name hadn't been chosen by accident. It represented the exact moment when Sarah finally saw the truth about her life, about James, and about the system that allowed so many women to be financially exploited. Now, that truth would turn into action. The foundation would use part of the assets confiscated from the Andersons to offer legal, psychological, and financial support to women who had been victims of financial abuse. Sarah wanted to make sure that no one else went through what she and so many others had endured. The fall of the Andersons reverberated quickly. With the family's documents made public, dozens of women came forward. Ex-wives, business partners, employees who had been silenced for years now had a voice. The case became a landmark in the fight against financial and emotional manipulation. Television programs discussed the scandal, lawyers reviewed old cases, and human rights organizations used the Anderson story as an example of how money and power had protected abusers for decades. Sarah hadn't expected to become a symbol, but inevitably she had. "Are you ready for this?" Samantha asked one morning as they had coffee on the foundation's terrace. They were still getting used to this new phase of their friendship. After years of being apart, resentment had been replaced by mutual understanding. "I never thought I'd be," Sarah admitted, "but I also never thought I'd make it out of that alive." Samantha nodded slowly, stirring her coffee without hurry. "I tried to warn you about James." Sarah looked at her and smiled, a tired but sincere smile. "I know, but I wasn't ready to listen." Samantha sighed, bringing the cup to her lips. "We're here now, working together. Who would have thought?" The two laughed, and in that moment Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: lightness. Meanwhile, Emma was recovering. With the proper treatment and far from the toxic influence of the Andersons, she began to rebuild her life. "Do you still paint?" Sarah asked one afternoon when visiting her. Emma smiled faintly. "I stopped for a while, but I think I'm ready to start again." The painting, which had once been just a hobby, now had a different meaning. It was a way to reclaim something the Andersons had almost stolen from her, her identity. Months later, Emma opened her first exhibition. The canvases reflected not only her journey, but the journey of so many other women whose lives had been controlled, manipulated, and destroyed by power and money. At the exhibition opening, Sarah walked slowly through the gallery, observing each piece. When she stopped in front of one particular painting, she felt a lump in her throat. It was the lighthouse, the same one Emma had painted years ago and given her as a wedding gift, the same one that had hung in her and James's home for years. But now she saw something she had never noticed before, the reflection in the water. It wasn't just a shadow of the lighthouse, it was a path out of the darkness. Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of the past finally dissolve. She was free. The Letty Jardin restaurant was exactly as Sarah remembered it. The soft lighting, the tables elegantly arranged, the waiters gliding across the dining room with the same impeccable precision. But for her, nothing was the same. The last time she had been there, she had felt trapped, subjugated by a marriage where every gesture, every choice, and even every breath seemed to belong to James. That night, when he poured wine on her face, the humiliation burned like fire. But today, what burned inside her was something else: strength. She crossed the dining room with firm steps, ignoring the curious looks that seemed to recognize her from somewhere. Some customers likely remembered the chaotic scene from that night. But if they expected to see the same fragile woman, they would be disappointed. She chose a table by the window and sat down calmly. When the waiter approached, he recognized her instantly. "Miss Sarah," he said hesitantly. She smiled with a lightness she had never had before. "Good evening." The young man seemed momentarily unsettled, but soon regained his professional composure. "What can I get you?" Sarah looked at the menu, not because she needed to, but because this time she wanted to choose for herself. "A glass of red wine, the best one you have." The waiter nodded and walked away. Sarah rested her elbows on the table and took a deep breath. Freedom had a peculiar taste, but despite being there as a new woman, she knew the scars from the past still lived inside her. They didn't completely disappear. No matter how many years passed, there would always be a part of her that remembered the days of control, fear, and loneliness within a marriage that had drained her identity. Even so, she no longer saw these marks as open wounds. They were medals, proof that she had survived. The Open Eyes Foundation was already transforming lives. Every week, new women walked through the door, seeking help to escape abusive relationships and financial manipulation. Sarah saw reflections of what she once was in them, and knowing she could offer an escape made everything worth it. The name Anderson, once synonymous with corruption and destruction, would now represent justice and reconstruction. And then, just when she thought the past was finally buried, destiny decided to give her one last piece of that story. A tall man in a dark suit walked into the restaurant, looked around, and walked directly to her table. "Ms. Anderson?" Her last name still sounded strange, but she nodded, signaling for him to sit down. "I prefer Sarah." The man smiled professionally and placed a folder on the table. "My name is Alvaro Ruiz. I'm a lawyer and represent Mrs. Emily Anderson." The mention of her former mother-in-law's name made a cold shiver run down Sarah's spine, but she kept her expression unchanged. "Emily is in prison. There's nothing left to discuss." "I understand," Alvaro continued, with the patience of someone who had expected this reaction. "But before her imprisonment, she left instructions for this document to be delivered to you." Sarah looked at the folder as though it were a trap. What is this? The final record of the crimes committed by Charles and Emily Anderson. She felt her breath catch for a moment. Why would she leave this for me? The lawyer leaned slightly forward. Perhaps because, in the end, she knew you were the only one who would make sure the truth would never be forgotten. Sarah took the folder with trembling fingers and opened it. The first pages contained detailed confessions, not only from Emily, but also from Charles. There, in black and white, were the names, the transactions, the illegal deals that had sustained the Anderson empire for decades. It was a grim testament to what it meant to build power at any cost. But what shocked her the most was the folded note at the end of the document. Emily's handwriting was elegant and firm. If there is one thing I've learned, Sarah, it's that no matter how hard we fight, we always carry the chains of our past. The question is, will you be a prisoner of them, or will you use them to build something new? Sarah slowly let the paper slide back onto the table. The answer was already clear. She looked at the lawyer and smiled. Make sure these documents are filed properly. I never want to hear that last name again. The man nodded, taking the folder back. As you wish, Ms. As soon as he left, the waiter returned with the wine. He served it expertly, and Sarah raised her glass, watching the red liquid dance in the light. The last time she had been there, the wine had symbolized humiliation. Now, it was a toast to her freedom. She took a long sip, letting the full-bodied taste fill her mouth. Then she looked out the window, watching the dark sky cut through with the city lights. For the first time, she realized she didn't need to run anymore. She was free. The Anderson story was over, but hers was just beginning.